Impatience is a common characteristic among those who are the heirs to thrones. And when that throne is the Golden Lion Throne, seat of the ruler of the known universe, and the fact that the previous incumbent has been occupying said throne for over a century and a half, it's not hard to see why Shaddam Corrino was, by his mid-30s, very, very impatient. Despite having lived for well over a century and a half at this point, Emperor Elrood IX still seemed spry enough to last another 50 years at the very least, and Shaddam was beginning to doubt whether the old vulture, as he put it, was even capable of dying. Even if his father died tomorrow and Shaddam managed to finally plant his royal hindquarters upon the throne, what then? As he'd grown up, he'd watched his father constantly being hamstrung and restrained by various other forces within the Empire. The major and minor houses of the Landsraad, the shareholders of Chone, and of course the influence of such groups as the Bene Gesserit and especially the Spacing Guild. What was the point of becoming emperor if Shaddam was not going to be allowed to rule as he thought an emperor should rule? It didn't help Shaddam that the one person in whom he could freely confide his frustrations was his childhood friend Hasamir Fenring, a man who, despite being wholly subordinate to Shaddam, was in many ways his superior, both physically and mentally. In fact, though neither man knew it, Fenring had been a potential Kwisatz Haderach candidate, but had been discounted by the Bene Gesserit when it was discovered that he was sterile. It didn't help matters that Fenring had an unpleasant habit of pointing out, however politely, Shaddam's many mistakes and failings. Indeed, if it weren't for the fact that Fenring was so useful, such as in the matter of assassinating Shaddam's elder brother, thus clearing his way to the throne, that prevented the Emperor-to-be from strangling his old friend most days. Ultimately, it was Fenring that persuaded Shaddam that rather than simply wait for the old man to die, he should help him along, as it were. As for the matter of Imperial power, well, Fenring had a solution to that too. In Dune, the entirety of civilization runs on spice. The Bene Gesserit need it to perform their prescient visions, the navigators of the Spacing Guild require it to jump between stars, and pretty much the majority of the nobles in the Landsraad were already addicted to the stuff. In other words, Fenring believed that the path to increasing imperial power was this. That said, even if he were emperor, there was no way Shaddam could move on Arrakis himself and claim it as the imperial fiefdom. For one thing, the Spacing Guild would simply refuse to help in anything that might damage their own power and influence. The trick, therefore, according to Fenring, was to discover an alternative to spice, have House Corrino achieve a monopoly of said alternative, and either make this alternative either cheaper and more available, thus making the Imperium more dependent on this than on spice itself, or by simply destroying Arrakis once the alternative had been discovered, thus making all forces in the galaxy wholly dependent upon House Corrino for their supply. As it happened, the first problem was easy. At least, easy for Hasamir Fenring. Ever since boyhood, in service to Shaddam's ambition, Fenring had devoted his insane physical and mental abilities to the art of assassination. And so, one dark night, he managed to circumvent the elaborate security systems between him and Emperor Elrood's bedchamber. Then, after using a paralytic agent upon the sleeping sovereign, he managed to surreptitiously implant a substance known as Niki into the frontal lobe of the Emperor's brain. By itself, the Niki was utterly harmless. The trick was that it was one half of a binary compound. Emperor Elrood was very fond of spice beer. Now, with the Niki present in his brain, every time the Emperor drank, the spice beer would react with the Niki, converting it into Chaumerki, a deadly, ultimately fatal poison. And with each draft, with each swallow, the Niki would become Chaumerki and slowly but surely eat away at more and more of the Emperor's brain. Either Elrood would go insane and have to be replaced by his young, mentally stable son, or he would die, whichever came first. It sounds impressive, but this was going to be a very slow-acting poison, requiring years upon years to actually do its work. It had to be slow so that the Emperor's deterioration would seem natural, and thus the two conspirators would avoid suspicion. All well and fine, but as I said at the beginning of this video, Shaddam Corrino was an impatient man. He was ultimately unwilling to wait until he himself ascended the throne to put the second of Fenring's ideas into action. At the very least, the project to produce a spice alternative should be started while his father was still alive. To this end, he and Fenring arranged, as if by chance, the appearance at court of a particularly odious Bene Tleilax by the name of Hidar Fen Ajidica. The Tleilaxu successfully pitched to the Emperor the idea of creating a spice substitute, as Elrood himself also chafed at the constant restrictions upon his imperial power. But what really got him to back the Tleilaxu was that the Tleilaxu wanted to overthrow Ix, whose technology they saw as blasphemous and violating the Butlerian Jihad. And it just so happened that Elrood had his own bone to pick with House Vernius, specifically Earl Dominic Vernius. Many years ago, the young Dominic Vernius had helped put down a rebellion against the Golden Lion Throne, alongside his good friend Paulus Atreides, the father of Leto. It was while the Loyalists were celebrating their most recent victory on Khitan that Dominic had caught the eye of Shando, one of Emperor Elrood's concubines. Despite the rich glamour and splendor of life in the Imperial Palace, Shando was, at this point in her life, tired of being one among hundreds, if not thousands, of women that were there solely for the Emperor to bed and possibly produce an heir. She wanted something a bit more meaningful in her life, like a husband and a family of her own. So she decided to approach the dashing young war hero, and very swiftly the two fell in love. Shando then approached Elrood and asked for permission to leave the harem. Though somewhat confused by the request, Elrood saw no reason to refuse her and was otherwise okay with the idea. That is, until word of Shando's marriage to Dominic Vernius reached his ears, and he realized that, in his mind at least, she had left him to marry another man. It was the kind of grand yet petty jealousy and hatred that only an emperor could pull off, and it was something that Elrood had been nursing for many years. Ajidica's accusations of Butlerian blasphemy, and the offer of a possible route to power for House Corrino, was all the reason the Emperor needed not only to throw his support behind the Bene Tleilax takeover of Ix, but to also lend them several hundred Sardaukar to make sure that the takeover was as swift as possible. With the Tleilaxu firmly established on Ix and the creation of the spice substitute known as Project Amal underway, there was nothing for Fenring and Shaddam to do but wait, as slowly but surely Emperor Elrood deteriorated thanks to the poison slowly eating away at his brain. After 3 years, the Emperor finally did kick the bucket, and Shaddam made sure that the body was cremated accidentally before a Suk doctor could perform an autopsy and possibly uncover the true cause of his demise. The Emperor's funeral and Shaddam's own coronation went off without a hitch. Well, mostly without a hitch. There was that awkward incident where the Harkonnens used a stealth ship to attack a Tleilaxu vessel and frame Leto Atreides. Not that it was the actual incident itself that was awkward for Shaddam. Leto was, after all, only a distant cousin of Shaddam's, and he neither knew the young Atreides Duke nor particularly cared about him. No, what was awkward was when Leto managed to send him a message claiming that he knew about Project Amal. Fearing what Leto might know, and worse, reveal, Shaddam had Fenring kill the only viable witness to the attack, the Tleilaxu pilot, and then made a fine speech in defense of Leto that ultimately got him exonerated on all charges. Still, Shaddam disliked being blackmailed just as much as Baron Harkonnen did, and this was the first of many things that would cause him to resent the young Duke Atreides, a resentment that would eventually lead him to conspiring with the Harkonnens to bring about the downfall of Leto and his family. Still, for the time being, Shaddam had most of what he'd always wanted: his father's throne, his father's palace, and his father's assets. But despite also inheriting his father's harem, the Emperor needed an official wife. And in a world of feudal politics, that's a lot trickier than it sounds. After all, marrying the daughter of one house could potentially offend another one. So it seemed something of a godsend when the Bene Gesserit approached Shaddam and offered one of their own as a bride. Sister Anarul was young, pretty, and, thanks to her strong connection to her genetic memory, deeply involved into the secrets of the Bene Gesserit breeding program. Shaddam, of course, knew nothing of this. He simply saw marrying her as a simple way of avoiding the quagmire of marrying a daughter of the aristocracy, and so consented to the union. Strangely enough, despite his own sterility, the Bene Gesserit also offered a wife to Hasimir Fenring in the form of a pretty blonde lass named Margot. Fenring didn't have much time to reconcile himself to his new marital status before Emperor Shaddam decided to not quite banish him to Arrakis. Now that the throne was his, Shaddam felt that he no longer needed to put up with his friend's constant pointed advice and even more pointed criticisms. Now, in fairness, this wasn't technically a banishment. Shaddam did appoint Fenring his official spice minister, assigning him the task of keeping one eye on the Harkonnens and the other on Project Amal. He even tried to soften the blow by making Fenring a count. Still, a light banishment is still technically a banishment. And while Fenring was never tempted to turn on his old friend, he did resent being treated so poorly in his eyes, considering all that he'd done for Shaddam since their younger days. Unexpectedly enough, it was Fenring's Bene Gesserit wife who proved the most effective balm for his wounded feelings. Despite the unlikelihood of it all, the assassin and the witch formed a genuine, deep, and loving relationship. Both masters of espionage, the new Mr. and Mrs. Fenring made a game of constantly trying to uncover the other's secrets. An unusual basis for a married life, but who am I to judge? Margot seems to have genuinely loved her husband despite his reproductive deficiencies, and in return the Count lavished much affection upon his wife, up to and including the construction of a greenhouse for her personal use at their residence on Arrakis, a construction project that, to any decent Fremen worthy of the name, required the use of hideously wasteful amounts of water. Alas, the new Emperor's love life was far less congenial. The years passed. Shaddam slept with his Empress as often as possible. She was pregnant 5 times, but each and every one was a daughter. Shaddam didn't know about the Bene Gesserit ability to control their pregnancies and determine the sex of the child, but he somehow, correctly, suspected that his wife was to blame for the lack of a male heir. In point of fact, Empress Anarul was indeed playing her part in the Bene Gesserit breeding program. The plan was that the daughter of Leto Atreides and Jessica would marry Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, a union that would in turn produce a son, the Kwisatz Haderach, who would then attain the Golden Lion throne by marrying a Carino daughter. A male Carino heir would only complicate such a smooth transition of power, and so Anarul ensured that every pregnancy was a daughter. Unlike Jessica, she was not blinded by such silly things as love. Eventually, an increasingly resentful Shaddam gave up on his wife and began spending time with his concubines instead, but by then, it was already too late. Just as Gaius Helen Moheim had infected the Baron when he had raped her, thus transmitting the virus that would cause him to grow fat, the last time Shaddam had taken Anarul to bed, she had given him an infection that rendered the Emperor of the known universe sterile without his knowing. Shaddam Carino IV would not be producing any children, male or otherwise. Roughly 20 years passed in this way, the Emperor growing increasingly frustrated both by his inability to produce an heir and secure his dynasty, and the lack of any visible progress in Project Amal. Over the years, Count Fenring made regular trips to Ix demanding progress reports from Agidica. The Tleilaxu responded always that he was doing everything he could, and in fairness he was. The Bene Tleilax had kidnapped several Ixian women and then converted them into axolotl tanks in order to create the Amal, the substance that would replace spice and ostensibly place all the power in the hands of the Emperor. It turns out, however, that spice is difficult to simply analyze, let alone replicate. But to his credit, Agitica was determined to succeed. Oh, not for the Emperor's benefit, but for his own. Agitica's plans can best be described as grandiose or megalomaniacal. He simply figured that once he had perfected the Amal, he would keep it all for himself, seize leadership of the Bene Gesserit, and then launch a war of faith to eliminate all who were not God's chosen people. That is to say, all who were not Bene Gesserit. Yeah, I can't think of a word that best sums up just how delusional this guy was. At last, roughly around the time that Leto Atreides and his allies were planning the liberation of Ix, Agitica was convinced that he had made a breakthrough and finally produced working Amal. After making sure that it wasn't going to kill him instantly, Agitica sampled some of the Amal himself and discovered that his mental faculties and his senses were enhanced 100-fold. The only seeming downside was that Amal was far more addictive than regular spice. The Emperor was thrilled, of course, but Fenring insisted on testing the new substance first. To be absolutely certain that the Amal was not just some newfangled poison, it was decided that the test must be on guild navigators. Accompanied by a Tleilaxu face dancer at Agitica's insistence, Fenring successfully infiltrated the Spacing Guild headquarters at Junction and swapped out the spice supply of 2 highliners with the Amal. Once the mission was completed, the face dancer, operating on secret orders from Agitica, attempted to kill Fenring, but the Count was far too good of a killer for that, and managed to overpower his assailant and escape. As for the 2 test ships, both of their navigators suffered extreme negative reactions to the Amal. One crashed his ship into Wallach 9 within spitting distance of the Bene Gesserit training center. The other, which happened to be containing Gurney Halleck and Romber Vernius on their way to infiltrate Ix and start up the rebellion, ended up jumping into an empty corner of space. Fortunately, there happened to be spice smugglers aboard the Highliner, and they were able to successfully replace the Amal with the regular spice, and return to populated space, though the navigator ultimately died in the effort. By the time Fenring arrived back on Ix, he had heard about the Highliner disasters and intended to confront Agitica and order the Sardaukar garrison there to arrest him. For once in his life, though, the Count was one step behind the competition. Agitica had successfully gotten most of the Sardaukar garrison addicted to the Amal and thus were under his control. As for Agitica himself, the combination of Amal addiction and megalomania made him deaf to all of Fenring's warnings about the hazardous nature of Amal, and he sent a face dancer disguised as the Count to convince the Emperor that the project was an unqualified success. Convinced that the Empire was now within the palm of his hand, Shaddam began setting the next phase of his plan in motion. Even if he destroyed Arrakis, he knew that most of the houses of the Landsraad maintained spice stockpiles. This was technically illegal, but such a thing had never been enforced before. Now, Shaddam used it as an excuse to destroy the stockpiles of spice hoarded by various noble houses, as a way of ensuring that there would be no alternative to his Amal. At first, the great houses were nervous. Then, Shaddam used forbidden atomics to destroy a spice stockpile on an artificial moon belonging to House Riches, and suddenly, everyone started panicking. Many protested, but Shaddam technically had the law on the side. And besides, every time a new spice hoard was discovered, it was confiscated and the proceeds were split between the directors of CHOAM and the Spacing Guild, keeping both the galaxy's financial and transportation authorities on his side. By now, the Spacing Guild had become aware of the 2 Highliner failures and the tainted spice that had killed both of their navigators, and they were determined to find the parties responsible for it. Shaddam, at this point just as delusional as Agitica, if less insane, refused to even consider the idea that it may be related to Project Amal, and instead insisted to himself that there must have been some other thing that caused the spice to be tainted. Either way, Shaddam sent a Sardaukar fleet to blockade the planet. Rather than use atomics this time, he allowed the Baikali to hijack a couple of freighters of supplies that just happened to contain a biovirus that destroyed most of the vegetation on the planet. Yeah, at this point Shaddam and his Bene Gesserit counterpart were undeniably going mad with power. But then the Spacing Guild did some further digging, and this time the finger of accusation pointed directly at Arrakis and House Harkonnen. They discovered some inconsistencies in the quota reports that the Baron had been sending them. Well, that's not entirely true. It wasn't the inconsistencies they'd noticed, the Baron had been smart enough to have those covered up, but the Spacing Guild employed their own mentats, and they were smart enough to spot the cover-ups of the inconsistencies. Either way, Shaddam was thrilled. He knew that the coup de grace to his whole plan was the destruction of Arrakis and thus rendering the entire Imperium dependent on the Amal, which of course he believed would be under his control. And now the Spacing Guild had given him the perfect opening. At this point, a lot of events, including those that were covered in the previous Dune videos, started to come together really quickly. Leto Atreides traveled to Khitan, both to see his pregnant concubine Jessica and to make two announcements. The first being a fleet of humanitarian aid ships under Thufir being sent to Betrayal, and the invasion of Ix by the Atreides military under the command of Duncan Idaho. In fact, Leto arrived on Khitan at the same moment that Shaddam was taking his Sardaukar to Arrakis. Meanwhile, another invasion fleet under the command of Rabban Harkonnen and the Viscount Moritani prepared to attack Caladan. For the sake of coherency, let's tackle this one planet at a time, starting with Khitan. While Leto was making his speech to the Landsraad, Jessica finally gave birth. Her Bene Gesserit superiors reacted with outrage when they discovered that instead of being a girl as they had intended, Paul Atreides was most definitely a boy. Jessica had defied their orders out of love for Duke Leto, and just like that, derailed the 10,000-year-long breeding program when it was literally within a foot from completion. Fortunately, the sisters decided not to kill her or the baby, and instead just walked away in disgust. Then, as Jessica was recovering from the exertions of the birth, Piter de Vries walked in. The Harkonnens' twisted mentat had been on Khitan for some time, carrying out business for the Baron Harkonnen. He'd observed Jessica and the unusual amount of security placed around her, and after several weeks' observation, noticed a certain family resemblance, and realized that she must be the Baron's daughter. Waiting until the other Bene Gesserit had left the room, Piter proceeded to kidnap the baby Paul and attempt to flee the planet. Learning of his son's kidnapping just as he finished his speech, Leto seized control of the palace guard in the Emperor's absence and proceeded to metaphorically tear the palace apart to find the kidnapper. In his attempt to flee with the baby, Piter was waylaid by both the Empress Anirul and the Emperor's truthsayer Gaius Helen Moheim. He managed to kill the former, but the latter promptly broke his neck, both to save the baby and to prevent him from revealing the truth of Jessica's origins. Now, unlike regular mentats who are trained in the official mentat schools, Piter was a twisted mentat, produced through the cloning technology of the Bene Tleilax, and the Harkonnens had made an arrangement with the Tleilaxu that in the event of Piter's death, he simply be replaced by a Ghola. However, since this is before Dune Messiah and the revelation that a Ghola can regain the memories of his or her past life, the knowledge of Jessica's connection to the Baron died with the original. Meanwhile, Thufir Hawat had returned to Caladan, having completed his humanitarian mission/decoy to Betrayal. Observing the harbor at Castle Caladan, Thufir suddenly caught sight of a pair of military scout ships disappearing just beyond the horizon. They had no markings, so he couldn't identify them as Harkonnen and Moritani ships. Thufir realized it could only be the herald of an invasion force while the Atreides military was absent. Thinking quickly, the Mentat spy master raided the Atreides armory for every holo-generator he could find. Then, enlisting the help of Caladan's fishermen, placed the holo-generators on each of their humble fishing vessels, disguising them as massive warships. As a result, when the invasion force under the command of Rabban Harkonnen and the Viscount Moritani arrived, instead of a defenseless city, they saw what looked like a massive naval armada ready to shoot them out of the sky, and fled with their tails between their legs. Meanwhile, on Ix, Leto and Romber's plan to liberate the planet was proceeding like clockwork. Caught between the hammer of Duncan Idaho and the Atreides military, and the anvil of Romber, Gurney, and the Ixian rebels, the Bene Tleilax and their Sardaukar allies were crushed. Count Fenring managed to escape his imprisonment and proceeded to hunt down Ajitika to make him pay for locking him up. Unfortunately, the Tleilaxu clone master had become just as addicted to Amal as the Sardaukar under his command. All that substance abuse caused Ajitika to die from massive internal bleeding before Fenring could so much as lay a finger on him. Seeing the Atreides liberation force and realizing that the game was up, Fenring managed to destroy the facilities used to create Project Amal, ensuring that no evidence survived. Finally, we return to Arrakis, where Baron Vladimir Harkonnen could only stare at the Sardaukar troop transports hanging almost literally over his head and tried not to soil himself, as the Emperor proclaimed him guilty of spice hoarding and gave the order to sterilize the entire planet, effectively destroying the spice. At first, the Spacing Guild thought the Emperor was simply bluffing, but as soon as they realized that he was totally serious, they immediately demanded that he rescind the order. Shaddam basically told them to piss off, he was the Emperor and he could do what he liked, and he was about to reveal the existence of Project Amal and threaten the Spacing Guild with it when all 5 of the Highliners that had transported his troops to Arrakis promptly winked out of existence. The Spacing Guild had left before he could deliver his ultimatum, and an ultimatum isn't much good if there's no one around to hear it. Just like that, Shaddam's decades-long plan was derailed. He couldn't even destroy Arrakis as he threatened to. Without the guild to transport his troops, what was the point? There would be nowhere for them to go. In the universe of Dune, the Spacing Guild has a total monopoly on transportation. No one, not the noble families, not the Bene Gesserit, not even the Emperor, can so much as move without their say-so. By departing Arrakis and leaving Shaddam quite literally high and dry, the Spacing Guild had not only ruined his plans, but they made him look weak in front of Baron Harkonnen and his own Sardaukar. And so the Emperor of the known universe could only scream in impotent rage as he and his thousands of troops floated in the void like so much useless garbage. The guild lets Shaddam sweat for a full day before sending a single Highliner to transport him back to Khitan. Fenring was aboard that ship, and he informed the Emperor of Ajitika's duplicity, the liberation of Ix, and the failure of Project Amal. Utterly humiliated and with his plan to seize absolute power in tatters, Shaddam IV returned to Khitan to face the proverbial music. Ultimately, Shaddam was able to weasel his way out of being deposed for nearly destroying galactic civilization as we know it. He had no male heir that could replace him, and his daughters were all too young to be married. And in the end, the Landsraad was unwilling to oust House Carino and cause the civil war that such a power vacuum would lead to. Instead, at the suggestion of Leto Atreides, Shaddam agreed to maintain a council of advisors hand-picked by the great houses. Officially, these men would advise him. In reality, they were there to serve as a check on his imperial authority. For this, Shaddam IV grew to utterly despise Duke Leto. This decades-long plan of his had been to increase his personal power. Now, instead, it had been undermined. Oblivious of the Emperor's antipathy for him, Leto, Jessica, and their son, Paul, returned to Caladan to celebrate the boy's birth and the restoration of Romber Vernius to his rightful position as the Earl of Ix. Essentially, it was a happy ending. At least until the events of the first Dune book, but that's another story entirely. Literally, in fact. But before I return to the usual Brainstorm lore content, there's one more thing to discuss next week. While the Atreides and the Harkonnens and the Carinos had been busy plotting and planning their little Game of Thrones in space, what were the Fremen up to this whole time? Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.